This was never supposed to be just a divorce story. What unfolded behind closed doors wasn't a quiet separation between two adults who simply grew apart. According to what's now being dissected, this was the slow collapse of a marriage weighed down by power, pressure, and unspoken resentment. Carlos King didn't frame this as a clean break. He framed it as a situation layered with complications, money, children, influence, and allegations that refused to stay buried. And once those layers were pulled back, the picture became far more unsettling than fans expected. Because when relationships exist under constant scrutiny, when family voices become louder than partners, and when legal documents are signed under pressure, the damage doesn't happen overnight. It builds quietly, relentlessly. What looked stable on camera may not have been stable in reality. What looked supportive may have been strategic, and what appeared consensual may not have been clearly defined at all. Now, with lawyers involved, narratives forming, and public opinion watching every move, one question hangs in the air. Was this marriage ever on equal ground? Or was it unraveling long before anyone was ready to admit it? And once you see what's being questioned now, it becomes clear the story is far from over. Then a few days later after that, on December 2nd, not December 2nd, what happened on December 1st, Todd Tucker's attorney, Randy Kessler, responded to Kandi's filing. And this is where things were said, Ebony, that rubbed the general public the wrong way. Not all, but some. But I wanted to get your what the public is watching now may look like a celebrity divorce playing out in real time. Legal filings, carefully worded statements, emotional social media posts designed to say everything and nothing at once. But according to the way Carlos King frames this situation, this was never just about two people deciding to part ways. This was a marriage that existed under pressure from the very beginning. Behind the glossy appearances and red carpet smiles was a relationship shaped by imbalance, financial, emotional, and psychological. And when those imbalances collide with family influence, power dynamics, and unresolved resentment, the end is rarely quiet. From the outside, Kandi Burrows and Todd Tucker look solid, successful, united, a blended family making it work against the odds. But Carlos suggests that what fans saw on camera was not the full picture, and that the cracks were there long before divorce papers were filed. Because when one partner enters a marriage already established, already wealthy, already protected, and the other enters under scrutiny, expectations are never equal. And equality is where marriages either survive or slowly break down. One of the most uncomfortable realities surrounding this marriage is the presence of a third voice, one that never fully exited the relationship. Mama Joyce, Carlos does not accuse, he observes. And what he observes is a pattern where outside influence consistently complicated Todd's position within his own marriage. Decisions were questioned, motives were doubted, intentions were challenged. Whether intentional or not, that pressure matters. When a partner feels constantly evaluated, not just by their spouse, but by family, confidence erodes, authority weakens, and eventually partnership becomes performance. Carlos frames Todd not as a villain, but as a man navigating a marriage where his footing was never fully secure. A situation where loyalty was expected but trust was conditional, where commitment existed but autonomy did not. And in that environment, even love becomes unstable. Another layer Carlos brings into focus is emotional distance. Not the kind that shows up suddenly, but the kind that develops quietly while life keeps moving. Career obligations, business expansions, touring, filming, brand building. According to the discussion, Kandi's world did not slow down for marriage. And while ambition is not betrayal, imbalance can feel like abandonment when emotional needs go unmet. Carlos raises the possibility, not as fact, but as a question, that affection in this marriage may not have been as evenly distributed as it appeared. That public displays of unity did not always reflect private emotional reality. And when emotional gaps exist, people seek validation elsewhere, sometimes openly, sometimes within boundaries both partners claim to understand, and sometimes beyond them. Which brings the story to the first major legal turning point. Everything you read, and I'm so glad you read it in its totality around a Todd's request on the custody piece, the Initial request, this is around a potential child support claim. Okay. So let's reverse engineer it. This is setting up a potential claim from Todd and his legal team to seek child support. I want everybody to immediately put spousal support on a separate shelf. A separate shelf. Spousal support and child support have absolutely nothing to do with each other. Okay. Spousal support may or may not even be at play, depending on whether or not the judge decides to uphold the existing prenuptial agreement. But child support. At this point in the breakdown, Carlos brings in legal expertise to explain something many viewers missed entirely. When Todd responded to the divorce filing, his request wasn't just about shared parenting. It included primary physical custody and final decision-making authority. And according to the legal explanation given, this isn't unusual, but it is strategic. The interview explains that custody arrangements often determine financial presumptions. The parent with primary physical custody typically becomes the recipient of child support, not the pair, which means custody isn't just about time, it's about leverage. This reframes the narrative. What some fans interpreted as a sudden power grab may actually be a calculated legal response. A move designed to rebalance a dynamic that for years may have felt one-sided. And suddenly Todd's public image, the hands-on father, the daily caregiver, the daddy daycare persona, takes on a different context. Not performative. Strategic, not proof of innocence or guilt, but proof that this divorce is being fought on multiple levels at once. If custody exposed the strategy, the prenup exposed the pressure. Carlos revisits footage many viewers remember but didn't fully analyze. The hours before the wedding, the unresolved negotiations, the visible tension. And this is where the second interview lands. The time frame, the fact that these two were 24 hours before their wedding, still going back and forth around the document itself, clauses what this means interpretation. Already that's applied to any judge, Carlos, because ideally for a prenup to be deemed kind of best practices, this should have been done months ago. Months ago. This should have been in the can. This is what this really is supposed to look like in best practices as we set a wedding date. And we each give our lawyers the document. Your lawyer drafts it, they send it to my lawyer. We spend at least on average with this kind of money. Involved a month to 3 months negotiating back and forth what's fair, what I like, what you like. Cut this out or draft this da-da-da-da-da. Then we agree on the document. I sign, you sign, it's notarized. It's in the can at least a month, if not 3 or 4 months ahead of the wedding date when you are just the nature of the pressure cooker vows start in 24 hours. Finalizing a prenuptial agreement 24 to 48 hours before a wedding is a red flag. Not automatically invalid but questionable, especially if one party does not have independent legal representation. According to the explanation, best practice is months in advance, enough time for review, negotiation, consent, without pressure. What's being raised here is not accusation, it's vulnerability. If Todd signed under emotional urgency, under wedding day pressure, without his own lawyer present, the document may not represent informed agreement, it may represent survival, and that possibility alone reshapes how the marriage is viewed retroactively, because a marriage built on protection for one side and concession from the other is never truly balanced. Another layer complicating this divorce is the question of relationship boundaries. Kandi and Todd have publicly acknowledged a non-traditional dynamic, threesomes, openness, flexibility. But Carlos raises the issue most people ignore. Openness requires rules, and rules require clarity. If activities were allowed only with mutual consent, then anything outside that agreement could still qualify as betrayal. And in court, definitions matter more than intentions. This becomes even more critical if the prenup included an infidelity clause, a provision that could dramatically alter settlement outcomes if boundaries were violated. Rare. Impossible. And in this case, the lack of public clarity leaves everything open to interpretation. This divorce is not just happening in court. It's unfolding in public opinion. Every post, every interview, every silence is being analyzed, not just for emotion but for intent. Carlos doesn't tell the audience what to think. He shows them what to notice. And what's emerging is a marriage that may never have been on equal ground. A partnership shaped by power, influence, protection, and pressure long before lawyers entered the picture. And if this is only what's surfaced so far, then what comes next may be far more revealing. By the time this divorce reached the public eye, the legal filings were no longer the most dangerous part of the story. What made this situation combustible was something far harder to define: boundaries. Because when a marriage operates outside traditional norms, clarity becomes everything. And according to the way Carlos King frames this unraveling, clarity may have been the one thing this relationship never truly had. Publicly, Kandi Todd and Todd Tucker presented themselves as honest, transparent, willing to discuss uncomfortable truths. They acknowledged a non-traditional dynamic. They admitted to experimentation, to openness. But Carlos raises a critical point that most viewers missed entirely. Admitting to openness does not automatically eliminate betrayal. In fact, it often complicates it. Carlos doesn't accuse either party of wrongdoing. Instead, he highlights a tension that now sits at the center of this divorce. What was actually permitted and what was assumed. Because openness requires rules, and rules require agreement, and agreement requires clarity. If intimacy outside the marriage was only acceptable under specific conditions, mutual presence, shared knowledge, explicit consent, then anything outside those boundaries becomes a violation, not of morality, but of contract. And contracts matter in court. This is where the narrative shifts from emotional speculation to legal consequence. Because once a relationship enters gray territory, interpretation becomes power. The tension escalated when People magazine entered the conversation. According to Carlos, the outlet reported that Todd was allegedly communicating with other women. The emphasis here is important, allegedly, but Carlos also makes something clear. People magazine does not publish without corroboration, multiple sources, verification, accountability. That distinction matters because once an allegation reaches a mainstream publication, it stops being a rumor and starts becoming part of the record, at least in the court of public opinion. And public opinion in cases like this is never neutral. As allegations circulated, both sides moved carefully. Kandi posted about emotional pain, about appearing strong while struggling privately. Todd responded with his own message, speaking about his challenges, his role as a father, his internal conflict. Carlos frames this not as coincidence, but as strategy. Because modern divorces are fought in two courts, the courtroom and the timeline. Every post is measured, every word calibrated, every silence intentional. And in high-profile cases, perception doesn't just influence fans, it influences leverage. As this narrative expanded, one uncomfortable question refused to disappear. If a marriage was open, what exactly counts as cheating? That question is not philosophical. It's legal. And this is where Carlos introduces the most consequential discussion of the entire breakdown. Go ahead. Go ahead. Two more questions. Two more questions. With that being said, Kandi and Todd have been very public and open about inviting women in their bedroom. It's been something that they've been very open about. This is not a secret. They have threesomes. They've been very open about it. They had this understanding. If there is a bad boy clause or bad woman clause in the prenuptial agreement, Carlos raises the issue directly but carefully. If Todd engaged with other women outside of Kandi's presence, outside agreed upon parameters, would that qualify as infidelity? The answer, according to the legal analysis provided, is unsettling in its uncertainty. There is no universal standard. One judge may interpret openness as blanket consent. Another may interpret it as conditional permission. And anything that violates those conditions becomes cheating, regardless of the marriage's public image. The interview emphasizes a critical reality. This becomes a judge's discretion, not based on public statements, not based on social media narratives, but based on interpretation of intent, agreement, and conduct, which means the same behavior could be dismissed in one courtroom and punished in another. And if an infidelity clause exists in the prenup, rare but possible, the consequences could be substantial. This is not about scandal. This is about definition. Carlos suggests that what once appeared progressive may now be problematic because openness without documentation becomes vulnerability. Without clear terms, one partner's understanding becomes another partner's defense, and ambiguity benefits no one except the party best prepared to argue it. In this context, Todd's legal posture begins to look less reactive and more defensive. Not a man reaching for control, but a man bracing against interpretation. As the legal complexities deepen, the emotional cost becomes impossible to ignore. Children are watching. Families are choosing sides. Narratives are forming faster than facts can keep up. Carlos points out that this is where divorces often turn hostile. Not because of hatred but because of fear. Fear of losing time, fear of losing leverage, fear of losing identity. And when fear enters the room, cooperation leaves it. Not just how it ended but how it functioned. Were both partners operating under the same assumptions? Were boundaries ever explicitly agreed upon? And if they were they respected? Carlos doesn't answer these questions. He lets them sit. Because unanswered questions are more powerful than accusations. Despite constant coverage, Carlos makes it clear that the audience is still only seeing fragments, legal filings without context, posts without subtext, statements without consequences. And while fans argue over loyalty and blame, the real decisions are happening quietly in conference rooms, legal briefs, and strategy sessions. It's far from public view. This divorce is no longer about love lost. It's about definitions of consent, of fidelity, of fairness, of power. And once definitions enter a courtroom, emotions no longer matter. Only interpretation does. And interpretation is unpredictable, which means whatever the public believes today may not survive what comes next. By this point, one truth becomes unavoidable. This was never just about love ending. It was about power shifting. When marriages exist at the intersection of fame, money, and public perception, divorce stops being private the moment paperwork is filed. And what follows is never clean. It becomes strategic, calculated, emotional, but also procedural. Carlos King didn't describe chaos for entertainment. He described a system activating because once lawyers enter the room, every past decision becomes evidence. Every silence becomes suspicious. Every public move becomes intentional. And in this case, nothing exists in isolation. The prenup isn't just a document. It's leverage. The custody discussion isn't just about parenting. It's positioning. The public statements aren't emotional releases. They're narrative shields. And when all of that converges at once, the marriage stops being a relationship and becomes a battleground. What makes this situation especially volatile is not what has been proven, but what could be argued. Todd's challenge to the prenup doesn't automatically mean it collapses, but it does force scrutiny. Timing, representation, pressure, context. Judges don't just read signatures, they read circumstances. And once scrutiny begins, it spreads. Because if one part of the agreement is questioned, everything connected to it becomes fair game, including conduct, including consent, including boundaries that were never formally written down but assumed. This is where perception becomes dangerous. An open marriage, when publicly discussed, often gets flattened into a single idea, permission. But legally, permission is never universal. It is conditional, situational, specific, and conditions that aren't clearly defined are the ones most easily disputed. Which is why the story doesn't hinge on whether something happened, but on how it is interpreted. And interpretation is power, especially when children are involved. Because once custody enters the equation, everything changes tone. Suddenly, travel schedules aren't ambition, they're absences. Suddenly, flexibility isn't freedom, it's instability. Suddenly, support systems aren't help, they're substitutes. This isn't about parenting ability. It's about framing responsibility. And framing decides outcomes. Carlos King made one thing clear without ever saying it directly. Both sides are preparing for multiple futures. Not because they expect the worst, but because they can't afford to be unprepared, which explains the precision. Why certain details surface when they do. Why statements are worded carefully. Why no one overplays their hand yet. Because escalation doesn't start loudly. Starts with positioning. And the most dangerous phase of any high-profile divorce is the one where everyone is still pretending to be calm. This is where narratives harden. Where fans choose sides. Where assumptions replace facts. Where speculation fills the gaps left by silence. And silence in situations like this is never empty. It's deliberate. What Carlos highlights subtly but unmistakably is that public sympathy is already being negotiated. Not begged for, not demanded, managed. Because sympathy influences pressure. Pressure influences settlement. Settlement determines legacy. And legacy matters more than reputation in the moment. Especially when children will grow up with the internet remembering everything. This is why nothing feels accidental. Not the timing, not the phrasing, not the distance, and definitely not the restraint. Because restraint signals preparation. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable reality of all. There doesn't have to be a villain for damage to exist. There doesn't have to be betrayal for trust to erode. There doesn't have to be malice for harm to occur. Sometimes the collapse happens simply because two people built something under conditions that could never stay stable. Pressure from outside, expectations from family, public exposure, uneven power dynamics. None of these destroy a marriage alone. But together, they wear it down quietly until there's nothing left to protect. Carlos doesn't accuse. He contextualizes. And context is often more revealing than blame. Because when you zoom out far enough, the question stops being who did what and becomes how did this ever survive as long as it did. That's the story underneath this one. Not infidelity, not contracts, not headlines, but imbalance. An imbalance that was tolerated, normalized, and eventually weaponized. What happens next doesn't depend on truth alone. It depends on interpretation, on discretion, on which arguments sound more reasonable in a courtroom than they do online. And that's what makes this situation so unpredictable because the same facts can produce radically different outcomes. One ruling could affirm the agreement. Another could reopen everything. One judge could view openness as consent. Another could view it as confusion. And in that uncertainty lies the real tension. This isn't a story racing toward resolution. It's one inching toward confrontation slowly, carefully, and with consequences that won't fully reveal themselves until decisions are finalized and narratives can no longer be controlled. Until then, everything remains alleged. Everything remains strategic and every move matters. Because in divorces like this, the end doesn't come when papers are signed. It comes when the story stops changing and that moment hasn't arrived yet. This story doesn't end with a verdict. It ends with something far more permanent: public memory. Long after court documents are sealed, long after headlines stop trending, what remains is the version of events people choose to believe. And once that narrative settles, it rarely changes. What Carlos King has laid out isn't a conclusion. It's a framework, a reminder that in high-profile divorces, truth isn't always loud. It's layered. It hides in timelines, in legal language, in what's said carefully, and what's never said at all.